So I think the context for this video should be relatively self-explanatory. One of the earliest projects that I did on this channel was a decade-by-decade ranking of the solo studio albums by Peter Hammill. An obvious supplement to that would be the live albums. Based on the comments, it always seemed like there'd be some interest in that. So, it always felt like a bit of an unfinished task, and having re-energized myself with my December hiatus, I think it would be good to do. So a few points of interest about Hammill's live work for those who don't know. First is that the format of these albums is quite varied. They all have his name on the cover, but some of them are entirely solo performances. Others have a key instrumental voice, or a rotating group of collaborators, or a full band. There's a spread of 40 or so years' time. There are varying degrees of sonic clarity and fidelity. There's anywhere between 1 and 8 discs in length here. So in that sense, the ranking feels a bit stranger than the studio decade rankings, where things tend to be pretty similar in format and style within the decade. The other key thing about these live albums is that Hammill is a famously spontaneous performer, in the sense that he rarely has a consistent set list. He tends to choose his set list about an hour before he goes on stage. The details of how he performs the songs will vary really distinctly from one time to another. He tends to perform with a very elastic tempo live. He might switch up details of melody and cadence and phrasing and emphasis in ways which, while not transforming the basic character of the song, would make it really, for instance, impossible to sing along with a live version of a song that you might know really well in the studio version. Now, that habit can be frustrating if you know the song inside and out, you have the template of it in your head, you're kind of expecting it. But of course, if you like the original, it's there waiting for you if you want to hear it again. And it does add a level of freshness and variety to any given live album that you wouldn't necessarily get from another artist who might be more beholden to a standard version. Certainly it's admirable that he tries to live within the songs in a spontaneous way, even when they're very old and often performed. And it's a benefit, I think, that he has from being a relatively obscure artist who's able to work with minimal expectation. I should note here that I'm not including the Peel Sessions compilation because most of the tracks from that release were spread out as bonus tracks on the relevant album. As always, I'm Hans from Electric Brain, Electric Shadow. We're a contemporary art rock project that is influenced by both the progressive rock tradition and newer forms and structures. Please do check us out. Look up Electric Brain, Electric Shadow on Bandcamp or your favorite streaming service.
Out of order, out of reach, breathless on the beach. No reaction.
So lowest ranked that I have of the bunch here is the 1993 album, There Goes the Daylight. I think in my studio review I accidentally called it Here Comes the Daylight, which produces a drastically different mood. Now this album combines a couple things I was critical of in my studio album reviews, right? The very underwhelming faux heavy guitar tones of the Noise era, the kind of simple inert drumming of Manny Elias. The wimpy guitar tone makes this album sonically underwhelming when it wants to be heavy. If anything, the songs even have less punch here than they did in the studio. And then the latter, the drumming of Elias, kind of keeps these songs from having the dynamic range and excitement that they might with another performer. And the song selection has the misfortune of pulling much of its material either from Sitting Targets or from the later 70s Vandergraaf Generator stuff, both of which were played much more capably by the K group lineup and, tend to suffer a bit by comparison. It does have the two best songs from The Noise, Planet, Coventry, and Primo on the Parapet, but I was hoping that those would gain some excitement and intensity live, and honestly, they really don't. The only really interesting thing here is the song Lost and Found, which doesn't really appear on, I don't think, many of the other live albums. One or two other places, but never with a full band as it does here. And this arrangement's quite different from the studio version. I really like that song, and while this is not an improvement on the studio, it's at least a change. Otherwise, I've never found much to justify the existence of this disc. I rarely come back to it as a listener.
You stood pitch perfect at the center of the flow, although nobody could know quite.
Second from last, I have 2018's X10, which is a set of acoustic renderings of songs from the album From the Trees. In fact, it's all the songs from the Trees, played in the same order, just with acoustic guitar and piano. Now, these were already fairly stripped down songs, so the fact that they're entirely naked here isn't necessarily a huge change, aside from removing a little bit of sonic interest and atmosphere. And even though Hammill is kind of known, as I mentioned in the intro, for really playing with delivery, in this case, the songs here are so new that if you do some side-by-side comparisons, he's not really approaching them with that same spontaneity because, the material's new enough that it already feels pretty fresh for him as a performer. So the difference doesn't seem as significant as it does with a lot of other live albums. I suppose, if anything, I did some side-by-side comparisons of these songs when I was preparing to do these reviews, and doing that has given me more appreciation for the production on From the Trees. When you hear a truly stripped version, as he's done here, it becomes really clear how even the modest bits of synth or backing vocal or bass really do fill in sound and mood on the studio versions. But the production on From the Trees certainly isn't dense enough to distract in any meaningful way from the vocal and lyrical content. So, while perhaps it's given me more appreciation for the production of the studio versions, that's not much of an argument for the existence of this piece on its own. Now, I am putting this higher than There Goes the Daylight because parts of that album actively annoy me. This album, at worst, is redundant.
Babylon strange, seventh wonder of the earth, gardens ablaze.
Third from last is 1999's Typical. One thing I'd say here is that the booklet for this album is one of the most interesting CD booklets in the entire Hammill catalog. It kind of justifies the purchase of the album, even if I'm not as keen on it. The booklet discusses in some detail his method for choosing a set list, and he kind of demonstrates that by creating a set list or pretending to kind of treat the song selection for the album in the way that he would in creating a set list. Kind of walks us through his mental process there, which is really fascinating. He also talks about his sense of the character of each of the songs, which is valuable for a Hammill scholar. So if you're the sort of person who's interested in, for instance, a video ranking Peter Hammill's live albums, it's probably worth it just to have this for the booklet alone. But while acknowledging the academic value of this album, I also have to admit that it's ultimately not as exciting as the things that are higher on this list. The nakedness here is admirable, but as a listener, it's hard not to be drawn to things like Voracious or Room Temperature, which have the same intimacy but with a greater amount of sonic interest, especially since a decent amount of what's here shows up in a slightly more fleshed out version on Room Temperature. At its best, this is a very good live recording of Peter Hammill, which of course can be said of much of the other things on this list. At its weakest, it also sometimes finds him struggling against the lack of a full band in ways which can be valiant but dull. Often that might take the form of making a bunch of noise on some instrument without quite doing anything that's very interesting. For instance, the piano solo in My Room, or the single guitar where he kind of tries to take the place of the whole band wall of sound in Modern. The song Train Time here, I think vocally is one of the best deliveries he's ever done of that song, but it's disappointing to have that incredible vocal without some of the impact that a full band would bring it. One other complaint that I might make is that the piano sound feels kind of small and dated and synthetic in a kind of early 90s way. That normally would be a minor complaint and easily overlooked, except, much of what's on this album is just his voice on a piano, so there's just not any other sonic element there to distract from it. So ultimately, this album is indispensable for someone who's very interested in thinking about and studying Hammill, but it's not something that I'm going to come back to that often as a listener compared to other things that I've put higher here.
what I once thought was everlasting, all of a sudden been.
In the middle of the pack, at number 7 here, I've put the, appropriately enough, 7-disc Pno Gt Vox Box from 2012. This is also the only thing on this list that I don't own a hard copy of, since I became a Hammill fan long enough after this was released that I couldn't really afford the resale prices. Now, I've mostly avoided any kind of personal anecdotes in these Hammill reviews, but when I did my own kind of deep dive in the Hammill catalog, I was working an entry-level administrative job for a state government agency, making a pretty meager wage, but I also was living without a lot of expenses. And there was about a 4-month period where essentially all my disposable income went toward Peter Hammill CDs. But I did want to hear this album, and I was finally able to find MP3s of it posted on some kind of sketchy Russian file sharing site that artificially slowed its download speeds and made you wait a certain amount of time between each download. I didn't actually have the internet at home at this point in my life. That's how broke I was. But our neighbors would let us use their Wi-Fi. So I spent several evenings in a row sitting on my patio outside in the rain with my laptop in my lap, because the patio was the only place we could actually get our neighbor's Wi-Fi signal, watching this very slow download from this creepy Russian file sharing site. Eventually, I got MP3s of the whole thing, which I then proceeded to listen to once. And this is 7 live discs of Peter Hammill, all recorded in 2010, but taken from throughout his catalog with a slight emphasis on the songs from Singularity. The performances are great, the recording is good enough, but it's quite hard to sit through a whole disc of this stuff because some of these pieces have appeared on live albums much more commonly than others. It's tempting to jump around to quirky choices like Faculty X or the tracks from Singularity and Thin Air. There's a version of The Mercy here that has a kind of quick, nervous piano arrangement that's very different from the studio version. Because if you are a longtime Peter Hammill listener, you're going to have heard some of these songs much more than others. You're going to have heard a lot more live versions of some of these songs than others. So, your engagement might vary a bit depending on how burned out you are on something like, Just to Slip Away, right? The thematic choice he's made here, where the songs are sorted into piano disc, guitar disc, Van der Graaf disc, that also reduces some of the sense of variety in material that might have made it a bit more engaging as an overall listening experience. So if you're comfortable doing a little bit of jumping around, if you're not somebody who, feels guilty for not listening to a whole album in a sitting in the proper order, there are lots of things that are of interest here. But the sheer quantity of it and the amount of live work that he's done means that some of it might be a little bit harder to sit through. And, relative to the price of the set, it's a lot to ask. I should note here that there is a 2-disc version of this album. It's always seemed to me like it lives a bit in the shadow of that kind of larger set. And everything on the one is, of course, included in the other. So, I've never bothered buying the 2-disc version because it just kind of seems like an abbreviated version of something that's meant to be a lot bigger. But I would put it in the same place in the ranking.
Time to clear my head, my demeanor emboldened.
One step up from Pno Gt Vox Box, there's his other major live box set, Not Yet, Not Now. I suppose Hammill is probably the only artist who could credibly release both a 7-disc and now an 8-disc live album, both within the same decade, neither containing any kind of archival material, and not necessarily having all the same songs, although there is some overlap in terms of material. But where Pno Gt Vox Box felt a bit more tilted toward things that were contemporary to 2010, this truly is an overview that doesn't seem focused on any particular period. That said, while an 8-disc live album is a natural consequence of a kind of, a variable set list and an enormous back catalog, a set like this does reach a scale where it's kind of difficult to really digest or retain the thing. Again, that's especially true when almost everything here has appeared on at least one other live album. Maybe everything here, but, certainly most of it, if not all of it. When I got my copy of this album, there were about 2 weeks after that where it was really all that I listened to, right? And on the one hand, it really did instill a sense of awe regarding the scale of achievement that his career as a writer has involved. But then on the other hand, the kind of the sense of monotony that you get after a while really gave me the urge to go back to hearing these songs with the specific sonic characters of their particular era. Anyway, I'm putting this one a little bit higher than Pno Gt Vox Box because it's a bit more evenly distributed by era, it's easier to find an affordable copy, and, giving, as always, the caveat that he's a world-class songwriter and a really engaging performer, this is maybe not the most exciting thing to listen to on its own terms.